Weird West is a game built on giving the player full control. Control that douse enemies in oil before setting them ablaze. Control that bury the dead or dig them right back up. To sneak around, go guns blazing, to be a hero, a villain, or blow the doors off instead of finding the key. It's an immersive sim, and the core principle of any immersive sim is to give the player as much control as possible to allow them to take their own approach, to craft their own story. And of course, the ability to shoot absolutely everything.
If you saw a coin on the floor, you could aim at the coin. If you throw a bottle in the air, jump and start aiming at the bottle.
That is Raphaël Colantonio, Raph for short. He's the co-director of Dishonored, director of Prey, and founder of Weird West development studio WolfEye. For Raph, being able to shoot anything in real time is one of the game's most defining mechanics. But it also sent the game into development hell.
There is moments where you really think, are we screwed?
When Raph and his team set out to make Weird West, they wanted to make the actual genre of Weird West, westerns but with horror and fantastical elements, and put it in an action role-playing twin-stick shooter set in a fully 3D rendered world. After all of those things have existed one way or another. Immersive sims, isometric RPGs, twin-stick shooters, all WolfEye needed to do was just combine them. What could go wrong? A lot, actually.
We initially had an idea for a strictly top-down, right, 2D kind of thing. All the twin-stick shooters that I had played back then, like Nuclear Throne or some other game, where it felt like, though I had never worked on a twin-stick shooter, it seemed like a solved problem, right? You aim with one stick and while you move with the other. And it felt like, well, we could probably do that in 3D. It would be a little more pretty. You're not constrained to a 2D plan anymore for combat, so you put some elevations. Sooner or later, you're actually in a 3D environment, like fully 3D, not just for the rendering, but also for the gameplay. But back then, what was happening is that we forgot that our plans for aiming system was based on a 2D system, and even some twin stick shooters that are actually rendered in 3D, they are still operate on one plan. That's the thing that did not click with us, with any of us.
Twin stick shooters operate on the core principle that one analog stick moves your character while the other aims where you shoot, and that's it. And that control scheme has remained unchanged since the genre's popularization with Robotron back in 1982. Which is a great game, by the way. Now, it may have evolved from flat pixels to fully 3D worlds, but how they operate, function, and move has remained the same. You point, and you shoot. Weird West, on the other hand, well, they wanted to do things a little different. Weirder, even.
As we implemented our aiming system, it was quickly hell. We quickly realized that we were stuck because there was no game that had pulled that off. There was no game where there were elevations and at the same time you could aim anywhere the same way you can in a twin stick shooter. The aiming feature, we thought we'd probably plan like maybe 4 weeks on it. But unfortunately, it probably took more like 4 to 6 months.
Even more, the problem arose 1 year into the game's development, putting Raph and his team in a pretty tough spot.
It was out of the question to not let the player aim at anything. And at the same time, at this point, it was out of the question to go back in 2D. And there is moments where you really think, are we screwed? Did we corner ourselves in a way where that's it? We'll never be able to make the game that we were set to do.
The team tried a lot of different solutions. They experimented with a cone system where instead of aiming a thin line of sight, the player instead directed a cone relative to the player's peripheral view. However, it was never a one-to-one representation of the player's intention and what exactly they were aiming at. So they scrapped it. Then there was the flick system, where the player would cycle through targets around them by flicking the analog stick left and right. However, cycling through every object on screen quickly became tedious and cumbersome for the player, so they limited the player to only being able to target NPCs. Which was a no-go, because it went against the immersive sim philosophy of giving the player the freedom to do what they wanted, how they wanted. So they scrapped that too. Things were not looking good.
One of the big pillars of the game was hinging on that thing to be a success. You know, it was a lot at stake. It would have changed we would have had to change the nature of the game severely. So that was not an option. Sometimes you gotta make a big shift and you think, okay, we give up. Maybe it would have led to another type of game, like, because sometimes from constraints emerges something really cool. But is it pride or a bit of I don't know, a bit of ego or something? We're gonna crack that nut.
They poured months of man hours into trying to solve this problem and were on the verge of changing the game entirely until they had a breakthrough.
Nobody believed it was possible. Everybody was ready to give up. It took us two different programmers to go through that. And the person who eventually found the solution, or at least the beginning of the solution, was Etienne Aubert, our lead animator, surprisingly. And he thought, forget about the 3D part. It's not a 3D thing anymore. It's like we render a rectangle that is constantly facing the camera. And even if you move the camera, the perspective, it will always cut anything that is under that line that you're moving. It's exactly like a cursor. So it becomes a 2D cursor, even though it's calculated with 3D stuff.
Instead of trying to figure out how to aim in a 3D space using a 2D control scheme, they created an invisible line tied to the right analog stick that wherever the player pointed it, it would render anything in its path as if it were 2D. So regardless of elevation, whether that's an oil lamp on a table or a vulture way up in the sky, if the line is pointed in its direction, it reads as though it is on a flat plane.
Now that I'm talking about it, sounds like super obvious, but I swear, when you're stuck in it with all those smart people around, and like most of the time it was like, I don't know, so it's funny that it came from an artist. I think artists will tend to not be paralyzed by the knowledge of maths. They'll look at the intention more than the engineering behind it, and so here he had the great solution for us.
Now, probably one of the most amazing parts for me hearing this story is that if I had not known about it, I would have just probably never noticed anything really remarkable about Weird West's aiming system, which is a good thing. That means Raph and the WolfEye Studio team did their job. Even still, despite all the time they sunk into the game's development to be able to execute on the vision they had intended, there's still a 2D mode. You can still just click on overhead mode, play the game like that, and I gotta give it to them. I think it's pretty fantastic that they still allowed the option, despite all the work they put in, to what they had intended in the first place. In the end, Weird West is everything it had set out to be. It's an isometric RPG, it's an immersive sim, and it's a twin-stick shooter, all at once. Something that was deemed impossible during the game's development. That is, if it wasn't for the perception of an artist.